Whoops, didn't realize I had started the timer. Sorry, folks. Here I am. Welcome back to another thrilling installment. Excuse me. Another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I'm your narrator, Pilot Fragath, and today we're going to be reading more of ManFac by Martin Caidin. Caidin? I think it's Caidin. Anyway, previously on, our boy Lance Parker, the protagonist, has largely recovered, psychologically at least, and has regained from his nuclear accident, and has gotten back the will to live in no small part due to his paramour Lee Grazzi, who just wants her man back and doesn't care what he looks like. Though the fact that she's now built him a cybernetic shell that looks just like him, but is better, faster, stronger, and can do some supersonic shouty thing. Probably doesn't hurt. So that's like book one feels like you could have left it there. Part one feels like you could have just ended at that point. It's like, he's back. But there's a whole nother book. Well, it's not a separate volume. It's another act. There's another act. In fact, I think there's three. Four. I take it back. There are four acts, if you will. And things get interesting. Now is when we get I think is when the primary plot portion actually kicks into gear. I have to double check. I would have to double check to be sure. We're going to learn that our boy Lance Parker, even though he has mostly recovered, isn't quite already all set. He's got problems of his own. Okay, that should do handily. That's how many pages? That will work. Okay. Each book is rough. Well, the first two books are roughly, I say book, again, that's how it's labeled in novel, but the first two acts are about 100 pages each. The third is shorter, and fourth is also shorter. I do not need that bookmark. I already have one. I'm losing it. I'm completely losing my mind. Please help. Alrighty, there we go. So yeah, that's basically it. Yep. I'm not all here, as you've probably noticed. Let's get cracking. Book 2, Chapter 11. Lee Grazzi stood alone in her laboratory. It stank of rubber and creosote and vinyl and molten glass, of burned metal and welding equipment and propane and other gases. That was bad enough. She turned slowly, the floodlights and spotlights and banks of dazzling lights on all around her. She was standing in the center of an insane charnel house. An unprepared visitor would think that the woman who ran this modern dungeon had a penchant for hacking, slicing, cutting, ripping, tearing, and savaging different limbs, parts, skin, and organs of the human body. Bits and pieces of adult males littered the floor, were scattered about shelves, strewn on tables, hung suspended from hooks and cables. There were pieces of skeleton, cranial sections, tendons, limbs, feet and hands, shoulders and stomach sections, knees and wrists, knuckles and fingernails, the lot. Artificial, surrealistic reality to fool the unknowing eye. Lee looked about her and chuckled suddenly to herself. Evolution and development and the billion and one miracles of what is life swept over her. Cherished myths and superstitions and theology and nonsense, and, good grief, what a fumbled ball of wax is this small gray mass between two human ears. Last night I spoke to God, and she say, "Listen here, honky," and I've been careful ever since. Does God wear skirts? Is male the dominant theme in the act of creation? Does the womb of life exist in the male belly? Can there be even godly creation without sexual union? She looked up. "I don't know, Lord, but thank you for this chance with Lance. I'll do my best, and if my humor seems a bit irreverent, it's only because I approach you with love and not fear. Besides, I'm tired, and you forgot to give me unlimited endurance." She worked for another 2 hours in the lab. When she was done, she took several minutes to study everything with great care. She nodded with self-satisfaction, turned on just a few dim lights, and switched off the brilliant overhead fluorescence. Lance looked at her. He shifted in his seat, an automatic gesture to accommodate the almost constant discomfort that filled his life. "You've got something up your sleeve," he told Lee. She sipped wine slowly, her eyes wide, looking at him across the rim of her glass. They'd had a light dinner of steak and salad and had followed their old tradition of always spending a quiet half-hour afterward. She noted the 30 minutes were about over. "Yes, I do," she said quietly, placing the glass carefully on the table. "I need your cooperation." Lance shrugged. "You've had that for a long time." "I need it blindly this time." He took on a wary look. "You've got more red herrings up your sleeve than the whole Russian fishing fleet." "True," she said casually. "However, it is what I need." "Full cooperation, huh?" "Blind obedience would be more like it." He sucked on a cigarette, let the smoke drift slowly from his nostrils. "You're asking a lot." "I give a lot. This isn't a debate, Lance. Yes or no will do very well, thank you." His eyes widened. "Testy, aren't you?" She shrugged. "I'm waiting." "No explanations?" He frowned when she shook her head, then took a deep breath. "All right." She leaned forward, her elbows crossed on the table, her head resting on her forearms, locking his eyes with her own. "You may not like it." "You've made that clear," he admitted. "I said okay, didn't I?" "I want you to be sure." "I'm sure, I'm sure. What the hell do you want? An affidavit, for Christ's sake?" She rose to her feet. "Let's go to the lab." He followed her, his movement swaying and forced. But he was using one crutch this time, not two. He'd worked on that little problem for weeks. On his own, he'd developed a different type of shoe with a high ankle and calf support that carried side weights effectively, and he had started moving with but the one crutch. It was tough. He pulled muscles and there was considerable pain, but he was hardening up even more and determined to stick with his new goal. And that's all it takes, she told herself. They walked through the laboratory door. Lee stopped by a control panel, stubbed a number of buttons, studied the console readout. Lance watched with interest as she activated intruder alarms in the infrared, shockwave, ultrasonic, and rolled the heavy steel door to the laboratory closed behind her, sealing them within the lab. He turned to look about him. "Why the special lighting effects?" he asked. He'd never seen the lab like this. A great hulking shape lay in the shadows off to one side of the lab. He nodded in its direction. "Something new?" "Yes," she told him, and her lack of words heightened his interest even more. She turned to him and motioned to a chair. "Please undress and take that seat," she said, her tone already noticeably distant. "What?" "You'll catch flies with your mouth open like that. Take off your clothes and sit in that chair." Nudity meant nothing to him with her. Exposing his racked and, to him, grotesque body meant everything. "Bullshit," he said. She sighed. "You agreed, remember? Full cooperation and all that?" "For tests, yes. For a circus, even if it is private, no." "You don't even want to know why I'm asking." "I don't care why." "You're not leaving me much choice. All right, forget the clothes. For now," she added. And he didn't like the tone. But she didn't press the issue. He sat in the chair, one hand holding the crutch idly by his side. She snapped a switch, and a light shimmered across the room from him. "Please focus your attention on that light," she instructed. He nodded, then concentrated. Anything along this line was all right with him. "Something special?" he asked. The light expanded and contracted and expanded and contracted in a strange, mesmerizing manner. Good. She wanted him to try to figure it out, to fight it if he wanted, but, above all, to concentrate upon it. She moved closer to him, stood by his side. "Can you figure out what it is yet?" she queried. He squinted. "No, why?" His attention was total. As he stared at the light, concentrating, she brought the hypodermic needle neatly into the fleshy part of his upper arm. He jerked back from the sharp penetration, turned to look at her. Confusion crossed his face. "What the hell did you do there?" Then he saw the needle, and alarm leaped into his eyes. At the same moment the drug raced through his system, and he realized what she had done. "God damn you!" he shouted, hauling himself to his feet, eyes wide and his face contorted. "I'll—" A talon-like hand reached for her. She stepped back, her face without expression. He grasped at her, and the crutch slid clumsily out from beneath him. "Relax, Lance," she said finally. "It works quickly. Just relax and go with it." He snarled something without words, and she stepped forward quickly to catch him as he slipped into unconsciousness, even before his collapsing body could reach the floor. She dragged him to a couch and laid him prone. She checked his pulse and heartbeat. Things were fine. Quickly, she removed his clothes until he lay naked before her. Damn, but this would have been so much easier with his cooperation. Bloody stubborn bastard. She wheeled a wide body-carrying device so that it rested over and straddled the couch. She slipped supports and webbing beneath his arms, crisscrossing his chest so his body would not slump, and he could be raised, with most of the lifting pressure beneath his arms and through his torso. She placed soft webbing beneath his buttocks and legs. Electric motors whined as he was lifted slowly to a cradled horizontal position. She wheeled him across the laboratory to the shrouded shape, now illuminated by dazzling lights. She removed the shroud, paused to study the creation that had taken months of careful, exhausting, and secret preparation. She breathed deeply several times. She had to complete this before the drug wore off. She used the power controls to lift Lance's unconscious form and move it into a great human statue. The first complete ManFac powered down, quiescent, brooding, shockingly lifelike. It looked alive because in every sense, save motion, It was alive. Just the spark. Just the spark. The cradle brought Lance up into a vertical position. With the gimbaled ring at the top, she was able to slide his legs into the ManFac legs, ease his torso into position, place the crisscrossing crotch webs firmly and tenderly against his body. She held his head in the hands of an angel of love and mercy. She made every move with sure but tender care. She mated the two. Symbiosis. Fingers, wrists, arms, elbows, legs, calves, ankles, jaw, ears, nose, temple, shoulders, pelvis, all had to be joined smoothly and meaningfully. She went through an elaborate checklist, a technological human manual of joined creation. Power flow, motor operation, oxygen, and pressure. Of both these men. The crippled living human. The lifeless facsimile of a man, about to be joined as never before. He was starting to emerge from the drug-induced stupor. She moved carefully but swiftly through the remainder of her checklist. When she was through, she closed the panels. She completed the form until it was human. She stood before the ManFac. It breathed. She stared at what she had done, checked the biological monitors, the power systems. She held a small mirror beneath the nose of the superbly muscled specimen before her. Fog showed on the glass. How strange. She laughed shrilly, a vocal alarm in the laboratory. She was surrounded by the most advanced automated, synthetic, bionic humanoid systems in the world, and yet she had to reassure herself through an ancient but tried proof of exhalation. She saw his eyes flicker. My God, the vocal system! If he regained consciousness without being able to speak, he would be trapped. It would be the mountain crushing him all over again. He could lose his sanity in a single moment of entrapment. Swiftly she threw the switches that activated the entire head system. Now he could speak and hear and, "What the fuck have you done to me?" The outcry without profanity would have alarmed her. His instinctive choice of words confirmed to her he was expressing more anger than fear. She moved directly before him, saw his eyes move from side to side, and then look at her. She gestured to be certain the movement captured his attention, no matter how momentary. "Lance, listen to me. You won't be able to move your arms and legs for a few moments. Just a few moments. I swear it." Critical point. Her words brought his attempt to move, and he was encased in a steel coffin. He couldn't understand what was happening, and the explosive urge, the subliminal claustrophobia from his long terror under the collapsed mountain could yet emerge full force. She had to thread the needle because if she activated him fully, he might not yet have sufficient control to think his actions. He would move instinctively, angrily, with fear, and that could ruin everything. "Let me out of this goddamn thing!" he shouted. His eyes moved rapidly from side to side as he struggled within the ManFac. She watched the biological monitors. Jesus, everything was sliding upward dangerously on the scale. She moved to the side, away from his vision, ready at that moment for a desperate gamble. He would start to shout now. He'd rant and scream at her. She moved the throat control to full output, rushed back to where he saw her. His eyes were wild, frantic. "Lance, please listen to me. Don't struggle. Trust—" "I'll kill you, you bitch! Just let me get my hands on you and—" She fell back as if struck with a terrible physical blow. Fell back, her legs like rubber beneath her, her ears ringing, her head feeling as if a vice had closed about it, and she tumbled sideways to the floor. The crashing thunder rattled through the laboratory, and they could hear glass still falling from where it had broken, could hear metal vibrating. It died away slowly. She lay on the floor, sucking in air, aching in every bone. A truck had run over her. Her arm raised weakly, and her voice issued forth like a half-drowned cat. "Lance, Please, I... She struggled up to one elbow. In the name of God, don't do that again. Frozen, as immobile as a stone statue with a living face, he stared at her, the shock of her pain overcoming his own anger. What happened? She made it to her feet and stood, swaying before him, looking directly into his eyes. That new throat band. I told you. Remember? It has more power.
But that noise, it was incredible.
It was you. He looked at her blankly. Instantly she seized the moment. Lance, you trust me. You always have. Will you bear with me a few more moments? The eyes became hard.
Get me out of this, whatever the hell it is, first,
he said with swiftly renewed anger. All right, she said, nodding, but let me get something first. You may change your mind.
Lee, you promised.
And I'll keep my promise. Just wait, will you? She hoped there was enough exasperation in her voice to keep him at bay a precious few more seconds. She moved from her peripheral vision, his peripheral vision, I would think that should say. She moved from his peripheral vision, and he heard her wheeling a large shrouded board that she stopped before him. It looked like a sheet of plywood.
What's that for?
He demanded. She held the corner of the shroud in one hand. I want you to meet someone.
Screw your damned games, he snarled. Just get me out of this thing and...
Lance! Ice in her voice stopped him again. She jerked away the shroud to reveal a large, flat mirror. I want you to meet Lance Parker. Chapter 12. He was beautiful. Disbelief flickered in his eyes as the mirrored reflection looked back at him. His face resembled what he had been before, yet she had introduced subtle differences. He looked as if he might be a brother to a different Lance Parker. She had avoided the error of attempting a true mirror image, facially, of what he had been before. That umbilical wouldn't need cutting. His neck was thick and powerful. If he was a remodeled Lance Parker, the most obvious difference was that she had added mass to the body configuration. His neck was thicker, his shoulders were broader, as was his chest, but the latter was also deeper. He had immense arms and powerful forearms. She had wisely avoided the weightlifter form in the ManFac body. He was more the solid, massive trunk with ribbed stomach musculature. A lumberjack with the superb muscle conditioning of a Roman gladiator. His thighs were thick and powerful, his legs columns of sinew and corded muscle. He struggled to move, and Lee moved quickly before him. You're not trapped, Lance, she said evenly, looking directly at him. You've got to understand that.
Why can't I move?
I've locked the systems until you've had the chance to see what you are, she said quickly. That's the only reason. I had to talk with you first, let you have some time to adapt. I apologize, I really do, but having to bring you through this with so little understanding... Oh, I apologize, I really do, for having to bring you through this with so little understanding, but...
Then why did you?
The anger was gone. He was questioning, seeking now. You heard your voice. Your voice. You used it without realizing how much power is added to the ManFac system, the bionic larynx, really, by tying it with your own. If you can be so dangerous with just your voice, try to understand what would or could have happened if you woke up and panicked with the ManFac systems fully powered up. Until this moment he had worn only bits and pieces and parts, gaping skeletal frames, and had bundles of wires and controls taped and snugged to his body. It had been highly advanced flotsam and jetsam, a far cry from a completed package. An automobile becomes starkly naked and skeletal if you remove only the outer shell. The comparison fitted here. She noticed that his rapid, almost frantic eye movement had stopped. Relief swept through her. Give me just a few moments, Lance.
Go ahead.
All this time I've been working towards this moment. Her voice came across crisp, sharp, fully controlled now. She had his attention between his ears instead of fighting only his gut reactions. The first correction The first correction in the artificial physiology, the bionic aspect, was to use manufactured systems, micro-miniaturization and amplification, plus the memory circuits, to enable you to speak as you spoke before. Now you're complete in terms of the ManFac system. There's more power available. And just as the neckband corrected and amplified your own injured vocal systems, so the ManFac is another step up the line. Thus, the volume while retaining your, well, let's call it a vocal signature.
Wrap it up, Lee. His attention span was lousy while he felt trapped. She hurried on.
You'd be no more than a fancy exoskeleton except for the most critical factor of all. The ManFac has a total memory bank on you as you were and can interpret every aspect of what you were before and then Did I reread a line there? You'd be no more than a fancy exoskeleton, except for the most critical factor of all. The ManFac has a total memory bank on you as you on you. That's why. Okay, I expect like a comma somewhere. The ManFac has a total memory bank on you as you were and can interpret every aspect of what you were before and then extrapolate what would be a normal movement in response to a nerve signal. She took a deep breath. I
Let it wait. Right now, this is a very attractive prison. His voice was low, controlled, a shade too ominous. Let me out.
She nodded. All right. One last thing. Do nothing rashly. Do you understand? Do it in slow motion. Think of what you want to do and then stop right there and pick it up again slowly. I'm releasing the holds. You'll be fully powered. There won't be anything mechanical or robotic about your movements. Slow, please. Very slow.
She left his direct vision again and disappeared to the side. Several moments passed. God damn it, when would she... His right hand balled into a... I'm having a hard morning. I apologize. His right hand balled into a powerful fist. The action caught him by surprise. He realized that he'd been attempting to make a fist from the moment he'd regained his senses. He started to move his arm, remembered what Lee said. Slow, easy, then even more slowly. He stared into the mirror, blinked. He took a deep breath and saw his great chest rise and fall. He turned his head to the right, saw his face partly in profile. Then to the left. He stopped. He didn't really want to move. Not yet. He flexed his arm muscles. Biceps bulged at him from the mirror. Holy Jesus! He raised one arm, full above him, brought it down slowly. Then the other. He brought his open hands together and rubbed his palms briskly. He looked up, surprised. I don't believe this. I can feel the movement, even the slight heat from the friction.
You have kinesthetic receptors, thermal receptors, pressure points, and feedback, all linked to your own hands, and they, in turn, are sending the signals to your brain.
He leaned forward slightly, testing his balance. Then backward. Hands on hips, he repeated the motions, then rotated the torso in calisthenics movements, but all very slowly and deliberately. He did a slow knee bend, nearly fell off balance. He looked up at Lee, questioning.
It doesn't happen all at once, she said quietly. You're still in the category of the experimental model. You'll need to practice again and again, and likely we'll have some modifications of the system. All in due time. Now keep the mirror before you. Walk toward it. Judge what you see. That way you can compensate from what you experience and what you can see.
He walked, stopped, bent down, twisted in different positions, squatted, sat on the floor, lay prone, exercised his powerful limbs. Tight in the pelvic area, he noted.
We'll modify the plexisteel frame.
When I do a full shoulder twist like this, he grunted, something pushes into my shoulder.
We can cushion that.
Try some push-ups." They were ridiculously easy. "There's no effort," he told her, looking up as his body, held absolutely rigid, pumped up and down through his arms. "Jog in place." He ran steadily. "Slight imbalance," he told her. "Experience takes care of that. Faster," she directed. His legs thudded like pistons into the floor of the lab. She studied the physiological monitors. "How much strain?" she asked over the sound of the pounding legs. "Almost none. Oh, I can feel it, but it's easy. Almost too easy. I feel like I'm disengaged, like I'm a passenger." "We don't want that." She scribbled notes on a clipboard. "We'll need some more resistance. Otherwise, you'll be unable to judge accurately your own speed or even the speed of body motion." He stood still, breathing normally, then walked slowly to the mirror. "I can hardly believe it. I'm sweating." "Thermal sensors. At certain temperature levels, the ManFac begins to release a synthetic perspiration. It's the same chemical composition as your own, with the ingredients of saline material, the odor-producing chemicals, that sort of thing. You'd never pass for long in society without such levels of normality." She gestured to her right. "Stand over here, please." He followed her bidding, and a powerful fan hurled cooling air at him. He found himself leaning forward, blinking in the sudden blast. "Your own eyes are feeling the air, of course," she explained. "I'm pleased. The temperature system is working perfectly. Your perspiration is just about stopped." She switched off the fan. She pointed again to another area marked with a circle on the floor. "Over here, Lance. Now stand perfectly still. Face that wall, please. Re- Remain completely still and listen as best you can." He nodded. A barely perceptible hum came to his ears. "Can you hear that?"
Yes.
"It's far below the ability of the human ear to detect," she said. "Feel the area on your face just ahead of and below your ears, where you would find the normal bony structure."
His hand probed, touched, pressed. "I feel it. What is it?"
"Implanted acoustic sensors. They work far down in the infrasound level, the super low frequencies, and they go right on up to beyond what a dog can hear in the higher bands. However, you have a built-in sensitivity control. If you press against the left ear, you can double the sensitivity input. Now be careful. It can get to be too much. The system is designed to let you detect pressure waves, what we call sound, but to bring the sound to you without harmful levels. Anytime you want to return to normal hearing, press the unit on the opposite, the right ear. For the moment, give me 2 levels in the left ear and tell me what you hear."
He followed her instructions. He shook his head in wonder. "You're breathing, Lee. It sounds like an air conditioning system. I can hear a deep pounding and—"
"That's your own heart. I was afraid of that. We'll have to find some way of filtering that out."
"The same with my ears. I was once in an I was once in an anechoic chamber." Anechoic chamber. Uh, the opposite of an echo chamber. Um, I was once in an anechoic chamber. I am having a hard time. This is entirely my own fault. "The same with my ears. I was once in an anechoic chamber, you know, without any echoes. Right now, I can hear the blood rushing through my ears, just as I did then. Can you block that out as well?"
"We'll have to. What else? Concentrate outside your body."
He stood absolutely still. "How thick are the walls of this building?" he queried.
2 feet. Concrete, steel, foam insulation. Soundproof."
"But they transmit vibrations." Any good engineer knew such characteristics. "Lee, you won't believe this, but through those walls I can pick up the sound of a jet. It's high, very high. It's like a distant echo, but I know a jet sound from anything else, and I can hear the damned thing."
"Excellent. All right, Lance, over here." She led him to a rack of clothing. "Use that chair. Your balance will take a few days to become automatic. You're moving more mass, and you've got to compensate for inertia. Well, you know the data. What I want you to do now is to start coordination exercises." She handed him clothes. "Jockey shorts first, please." He looked up with a sheepish grin. I forgot I was naked, he said. Know when I remembered? She smiled. When I gave you the clothes, I imagine. No, when my ass hit this cold chair. It's incredible. I could feel myself, the cold against my body. I mean, even though I'm wearing, or inside, or whatever. His voice fell off, and he slipped on the shorts. He followed with baggy gym trousers, a sweatshirt, socks, and sneakers, then went back to the mirror and stared at himself. He turned to Lee. I'd get a lot of help from videotape. You can look at yourself later. All this is recorded. But from now on, nothing goes under the camera unless you say so. I appreciate that. What's next? What may be the most difficult, strangely enough. It was. He slopped water like a clumsy child when he tried to drink. She stopped him and placed a straw in the glass. Try that. He sipped through the straw, felt the cool water within his own body. Piece of cake, he grinned. You'll need work with using glasses and cups. We'll schedule that. I think you'll need some time with food. The distance your arm travels, the heft of your muscles. The computer can do only so much. The rest is practice, experience, then compensation by reflex until you do such things automatically. She smiled. I think we deserve a toast to tonight. Ever try champagne through a straw? His laugh was that of a child who has just discovered magic can be real. The next several days flew by. Lance moved through a bubble of enchantment at the incredible new life given him by Lee. He went through dozens of exhausting tests, and where before he had quickly reached limits he refused to exceed, now there was no stopping him. He came to hate those moments when he had to withdraw from the ManFac, for each such withdrawal was its own traumatic nightmare of returning to the crippled body that would be his the rest of his life. It's like being Cinderella, he said wistfully. The clock strikes midnight and suddenly I'm a pumpkin again. Do I register that as a complaint? She asked. He shook his head. No, thank God. I'm beyond that now. That was the most critical part of all, she told him. If you fell victim to the reality of yourself, we had big troubles before us. Because this is not magic. It's materialistic in the cruelest sense, if you want to think of it that way. Look at what we've done, though. In a few days, you've become as natural in the ManFac as you were before the accident. In some ways, your own body mass and balance were better. For example, you'll never be as agile or as splendid on the high bar or in tumbling as you were before. A 14-year-old girl has more grace and flow and rhythm than you can ever have, but he broke in with a wide grin. I yield to the young lady. I look lousy in leotards anyway. Excellent. Your attitude, I mean. Why, thank you, ma'am. Gallant, too. But I meant what I said. The worst enemy you'll have in creating a whole new lifestyle is understanding your limitations. The envelope of your experience and possibilities, to steal a phrase from some dashing test pilot. He nodded. I've got to be the kind of a pilot who flies, but whose airplane is not a machine. At first, that sounds like a paradox, but it isn't. Not really. It's like being a living extension of one. There are pilots, and there are pilots. The best of them recognize the ultimate, and they all say the same thing about them. They don't get into their airplane, they wear it. She nodded. Like that air show we saw with Bob Hoover. I still don't believe that one. Great example. Hoover in an airplane is a living extension through his machine of his desires. He can't fly, Lance emphasized. He needs the machine. So he blends in, and he uses all that power and fury and skill, and he flies in a way that gives a bird envious ulcers. He's the perfect match. He's the man-machine gestalt, Lee interrupted. In the case of a man like Hoover, it's almost as if the airplane anticipates his responses to the controls. Gestalt, a final product that is so much greater than adding one on one and so forth. You 1. The ManFac, 1. Putting you together doesn't just make 2. It squares and compounds and magnifies enormously. One-on-one, Parker and ManFac creates something entirely new. You're a body surrounding alter ego, an extension of self. Maybe, she grimaced, I'm taking someone else's words out of context, but you get my meaning. Come with me. Let me show you another thing you haven't seen yet about your new self. In the laboratory, she wheeled a cradling device to room center and picked up a steel bar. ManFac, she said crisply, experimental systems only. She looked ruefully at the experimental... Oh. In the laboratory, she wheeled a cradling device to room center and picked up a steel bar. ManFac, she said crisply, experimental systems only. She looked ruefully at the experimental body before them. I vent my frustrations on him. Take out exasperation. The giant by her side stood quietly. I could have used him myself, he reflected. She shook her head. Not the same thing, love. Different intents. I mean, he's not just for bashing about. There's purpose in all this. She hefted the steel bar. Take a good look at his skin. The hair isn't synthetic. It's human. It burns and it stinks the way human hair does. Most people don't realize how endurable human hair can be. The best wigs aren't synthetic. They're homegrown, clipped like a sheep, and sold elsewhere. He glanced at his burly forearms and then brushed his head with his hand. She laughed. Don't ever bother to ask. You, too. Head, eyebrows, body, pubic, all of it. But pay attention. This skin is the same as yours. It's not as finely developed, but the structure is the same. Flex metal, plaster metal surfacing, thin woven honeycomb, accommodations for connecting and supporting areas where there would normally be muscle, tendon, bone, sinew, that sort of biological glop. I hadn't quite thought of myself, at least the new self, as glop, he protested. A rose by any other name, she said, shrugging. Watch, will you? Before he could answer, she stepped forward like a slugger at home plate and brought the steel bar up and then down in a wicked, devastating blow against the left shoulder of the ManFac before her. The heavy structure rocked backward slightly, seemed to shudder, and finally was still. Christ, I could almost feel that, Lance said. He went forward to examine the deep crease she had pounded in the shoulder area. You've pretty well crushed it, he noted. Was that necessary? He turned back to Lee. Look not at me, sir. She had a satisfied smirk on her face. Observe carefully yon damage to your bosom buddy. He looked, and then he stared, and then his fingers brushed lightly across the shoulder of the ManFac, because the deep indentation was slowly but surely vanishing. The form was filling in again, and as he kept watching, the shoulder returned to normal shape. Holy Christ, he muttered, it's even got a bruise. Well, it looks like a bruise, but that's simply an unexpected effect. A bit of cosmetic serendipity, you could say. In real life, that blow would leave a bruise. This one does the same. I told you the material is a mixture, a compounding of plastometal, plastiskin, and that new honeycomb sandwiching, and it's all constituted of memory molecules. Until the material itself is destroyed molecularly, it will always regain its shape within 20 to 40 minutes. The difference is determined by temperature and pressure. She turned to a control desk and began flipping switches. We have some important work to do. I need to mix the physiological reports of you in that thing. I need to mix the physiological reports of you in that thing with the computer inputs and the feedback. Think you can stand about 2 hours of testing? You can start by punching holes in those wooden panels over there. And then there's some wood and metal I want you to bite through. Bite? He echoed. A German shepherd has 700 pounds per square inch biting force, lover. You have 900 or so. You can literally bite your way through thick ropes and lesser cables, to say nothing of the stakes you accuse me of murdering. He felt incredibly good. You name the test and I'll play the tune, he told her. Like I said, 2 hours. What then? No fun on that face at which he looked.
Then it's Cinderella time, and you become a pumpkin again.
Yeah, I know, he said quietly. Chapter 13. Cinderella time was a bitch. He didn't believe just how tough it was. Not merely the first time, but the second and the third, and it became worse with every occasion when he had to quit being a human specimen, in many ways beyond even his wildest fancies as a kid. Lee felt his deep, searing introspection, the soul-searching to which he subjected himself. There was the kind of withdrawal he went through every time, each separate occasion, that could have broken a will less strong than that of Lance. It was like losing an arm or a leg forever. It was a deliberate acceptance of torn face and scarred lips and gnarled ear, where moments before there had been a rugged face that didn't scare the hell out of children. His past was gone forever. If he accepted that deep within himself, he could apply that marvelous mind to the future. He could face life with an altered but wholly viable zest and appeal that had marked his days before the mountain. The rules were the same: live fully or die slowly. There were really no in-betweens.
You'll have to learn to bring together the two personalities of yourself, Lee warned him. But you can never go through a constant shifting through this diaphragm of Jekyll Hyde. You've got to stay in full control of both men, the before and the after, no matter which role you're playing at the moment.
Tough, he murmured.
History is filled with people who were told they could never again do this or do that. Men who couldn't walk and ran the world's fastest mile, she reminded him. Pilots who failed air cadet school and tried the back door and became great heroes, and so on. You know this. Can you imagine the world losing that beautiful brain of Charles Steinmetz, the ultimate genius of electricity, because he had the poor little me syndrome? He was partially a hunchback. He was ugly and scrunched up, and the greatest men of science in all the world sat adoringly at his crooked feet.
He growled at her. There's no self-pity here, Lee.
But there is a struggle, she persisted.
Jesus Christ, do you expect me not to have one?
No, I'm just trying to let you know you don't stand alone at your personal crossroads.
He looked at her, and he didn't smile, but there was something deep and warm in his eyes. I know that. I have for quite some time now. I suppose, he sighed, even when I fought you, I knew it.
You never fought me, she said quietly. It was always yourself.
Yeah, he agreed. He wondered about himself. He toyed with the theology of it, if there was anything of that nature. Was it straight out of cards dealt blindly in life? He could accept that. Fate dealt the hand, and you played or bluffed or drew new cards, but ultimately you had to play those in your hand. He laughed aloud, and Lee studied him.
There was some deep humor in that sound, she observed.
I was thinking of the fanciful and wonderful celluloid world of television, he said.
She smiled. I can guess. The Bionic Man.
Uh-huh. The old $6 million man smoothie. Old Stoneface mumbling at the camera. The made-to-order idiot.
Leaping over tall buildings.
Not without ear-stabbing sound effects, he added.
And his bionic girl, falling out of the sky and waking up Supergirl. Oh, and his bionic girl, falling out of the sky and waking up Supergirl.
They laughed together. And who could forget the bionic boy, and the bionic dog, and the bionic asshole, he said.
Well, she tweaked him lightly, you could have a bionic dog.
What?
To use the terms I overheard when my dear father was playing poker with his friends, and I was a young girl who was supposed to be asleep, she explained. A dork, pecker, cock, schwanz, meatloaf.
Good grief, he said, honestly taken aback.
Every word except penis, she added.
He looked quizzically at her. "And you think I want some electronic dildo hanging between my legs, springing pinkly erect when I press a hidden button?" She showed sharp teeth.
Don't you?
"Hell no!" he said with unexpected vehemence. "There are some things a man wants to do on his own." The toughest exchanges weren't with Lee. They were in his own head. Because the fact of it was that sometimes he felt like the bionic village idiot. He had so much more than great strength. He had brains and intelligence and training and knowledge and capabilities built into the ManFac over which other men would have drooled. But, and it was a deeply meaningful but, were this ManFac system and its promise really more than a glossed over super caricature of a man? Beset by doubts and honestly questioning the future, he wondered if he could truly, deeply within himself, be something more than polished ceramics. What had he called himself one night? A computer-prodded ghost of a lost Lance Parker. In a way, the ghost of Christmas past. Not so long ago, he had wanted desperately to kill himself. That weakness, no matter how real and terribly urgent, was behind him. Strange. Now that he had the strength to storm the future, the greatest doubt he faced was himself. Lee didn't give him that much time to wallow in his own thoughts. You don't create a quantum leap in the man facsimile system and then just leave it wandering around. If there were a dozen improvements, there were 1,000 changes and modifications to be made, and all of them could emerge only from testing, experimenting, trials, and failures. No one ever succeeded until he had, in one way or the other, failed. Success is handling all the little failures with ease and confidence. It's what gets you through the dark nights. Those are actually some pretty good words to live by. that's that's reasonably sage advice. No one ever succeeded until he had, in one way or the other, failed. Success is handling all the little failures with ease and confidence. It's what gets you through the dark nights. There was little, indeed, on which either of them could draw for advice or counsel of true guidance. It was as if he had sidestepped the rest of the human race onto another plane of existence. But there was no other way than to return to square one and take that giant first step. It was called understanding the system and the environment. Like climbing a mountain. All the best equipment in the world didn't mean a damn if you didn't know how to use it. And you had to understand mountains as a mass as well as the tiny details of rock, and what weather could do, and you always had to watch the clock because climbing a sheer, slippery face in daylight was really not the same as clawing your way up the same wall with a flashlight gripped in your teeth. That was just a faster way to get killed. Or flying an airplane. Once you knew what to do, it was easy. Flying a 747 was a hell of a lot easier than handling a tricky training plane with a tail wheel that cavorted and danced and whipped about madly in a crosswind. But it was a long road to being easy and comfortable in the 747. The long road was the experience and the know-how and the confidence you acquired en route. He needed to know, understand, comprehend everything about the ManFac system that had emerged from the genius and the love and the patience of Lee Grazzi. Yet where she was brilliant, she also had moments and quicksands of inadequate knowledge. He was an engineer and looked upon their problems with a perspective different from hers. She's also an engineer, but whatever. He was the man who became the ManFac, and that gave him a hell of a different view. That's true enough. Now it was time, because they had come so far together, to apply their talents as a team. He knew engineering and power systems. He knew trusses and bridge building and cantilevered designs. He knew pressure and flow and materials. And with all this, he was, as he had always been, swift to learn, quick to seize on the most basic as well as the most advanced systems. He was as much a mechanic and an electrician and a tinkerer as he was a professional engineer. He'd worked with remote control systems, and he understood intrinsically the highly complicated and advanced intermeshing systems created by Lee, and quickly, much more quickly than either of them had expected, he became as much the teacher as Lee had been to him. He could judge the ManFac both as a collection of parts and as a single unit unto itself. He could think in parallel lines, and every time he discovered a fault or a weakness, he was able to bring his own input into the problem. Rubbing, chafing, hard points were small problems in comparison to channeled power and sensor systems. That was wrong. A man can handle a broken leg a lot better than he can a sharp cinder in his eye. The first will inconvenience him and diminish his daily envelope of performance. The second, unless it is removed, will drive him insane. The prosaic is often the prosaic is more often the seemingly insuperable than the exotic problem. Those pressure points drove him to distraction, much as they had the astronauts who went through one generation after the other of high altitude flight suits, and then the suits tailored specifically to the hard vacuum of space.
We're not facing the same conditions,
We're not facing the same conditions, Lance complained to Lee, so why are we trying to solve things the same way? No matter what you do, like eliminating a chafing point in one place, it seems just to shift it to another. I think I know a way to eliminate that. And he did, and it was surprisingly simple. If a chafing point built up, he was able to seal the suit, to pressurize the system slightly, and bring a layer of air between his body and the suit. It was as if he rode within an invisible layered cushion separating parts of his body from the ManFac system. After slopping and splashing for several weeks, he mastered the techniques of eating and drinking in normal fashion. The technique that had so long defied Lee's design was in the interface between Lance's scarred lip tissue and the inner layers of mouth and chin, and, above all, the upper lip and those of the ManFac. The lips and mouth are astonishingly flexible, even wildly rubbery, and they depend as often on liquid lubrication as they do on this facility of extraordinary and misshapen movement. The ability to pucker up, to whistle, to open wide, to operate tongue and palate and the edges of the cheeks, to move air as well as liquid and physical objects in and out, is one of nature's most ingenious engineering feats, and nature just didn't accept Lee's ManFac meddling. At least, nature refused to yield without a fight. It was slow, tiresome, and often painful, for the scarred skin tissue rubbed raw, chafed quickly, and healed slowly. The solution, again, appeared from an unexpected source. Lee used pigskin tissue and designed the ManFac for easy replacement of this tissue when necessary. Lance came up with the idea not from ingenuity, but from memory. Pigskin, the closest product of nature to human skin. They'd used the hapless porkers for atomic bomb tests, tethering them in the open so they would be seared by the violent infrared radiation of the exploding fireballs, and the more they learned, the more amazed they were that pigskin was less than 1% variable from human skin. Pigskin found its way into burn wards, surgical wards, and the like. Treated with chemicals to sustain its beneficial characteristics, it could stand in for human skin for weeks at a time. Presto, that problem went into the solved ledger. I think, Lance grumbled uncomfortably during a suit test, that the toughest problem with this suit is what we're doing now. He shifted his weight and grimaced at Lee.
Little boy doesn't want to make cocky.
Her voice was sugary, and her expression one of torment. His, not hers. He gaped at her choice of words, to say nothing of her leer. Little boy doesn't... His echoed response stopped dead, and he glared at her. God damn it, Lee,
Oh, shut up and just try it. And just try to take a dump, will ya? she demanded. Or would you rather I revert to clinical terminology? She stepped back and curtsied. Please pass the feces, good sir. Is that better? Or would you have me ask you to spill the stools into this liquid-filled ceramic receptacle?
What the hell's gotten into you? He shouted.
There's nothing polite about taking a crap, she shouted back. Do you need privacy? At this point of the game, for God's sake? I've just about crawled through your intestines and your bowels for a year, and now you get cute. Jesus, Lance, if you're ever going to adapt to the ManFac system, we've got to know if you can pass physical waste through the anal interface, or if we have to store the bulk in containers, and that means germicides and sealants and all that nonsense, and it would be a lot easier if we could—
I hope to God we're recording this, he said, exploding into laughter. Great moments in history. What a terrific show for HBO.
HBO, hot bowel offerings?
I can see it now, he said, making a grand gesture with one arm. Ta-da! Lights, action, and camera. Proctoscope.
A rear-end view of the news, she cried.
No shit, he shouted.
That's the problem, she reminded him.
They sobered quickly, and she snapped her fingers.
Idea time. We can't quite go to sphincter to sphincter. Tough tango to handle. But what if we created a partial vacuum, which you could set up through a separate control about the buttocks when you did have to go? What that would keep the ManFac interior buttock area firmly against your own skin, and there'd be no interference with the anus.
I hate this, he murmured.
And there'd be no interference with passing physical wastes, she pressed on. In fact, elimination and cleaning would be about as normal as one might expect. She patted him on the arm. I'll make the preliminary drawings, love. In the meantime, you just grab yourself a handful of privacy and have your own quiet little dump. See ya!
And she was gone. Not so flippantly, he realized later. She had managed to make him emerge through the emotional thicket with a half grin on his face. That woman was incredible, he thought with renewed admiration. He had, with her help, overcome a savage determination to end his life in 100 different ways, and she had anticipated that all their success to date could have been tossed through the nearest window if he had become hung up on a subject that had all sorts of psychological hooks to it, going all the way back through dark emotional passageways to childhood. He brooded on the subject, and the more he thought about it, the more he came to appreciate just how carefully Lee had guided him. Human nature was a most curious beast. The man who napalms an entire village of men, women, and children won't say fuck before his mother. That's really bad. And it is, if the taboo has been cemented in his mind structure so heavily that the very act of verbal utterance triggers a guilt complex. She had teased him on the matter of bowel movement. Just something to pass by, right? Good God, how badly were people hung up on these social thorns? There were people who would rather die, literally, than shit before an audience. There were people who had died because of their mind-frozen inability to climb over a wall of social emotional no-no. And what was even wilder was that through their exchange, Lee had produced the engineering biological answer to the problem. The air seal, that pocket of partial vacuum, would work. Except that he had spent so much damned time thinking about it that he just couldn't go. It was the next day before he could even bring himself to talk about it with Lee. I got a problem, he muttered. By way of answer, she raised her brows and waited. I'm constipated, he blurted out. She laughed so hysterically tears ran down her cheeks. She didn't miss many tricks. To Lee, the ManFac wasn't just a system, but a way of life into which Lance would have to fit and then function without detection. Those were the magic words, to function without detection. She also thought far ahead of his own hopes. The ManFac would provide Lance with many physical capabilities that were far beyond what his own body could provide even before his accident. But he had been capable of certain graceful movements and rhythms she could not infuse within a ManFac system. So he had to adapt to what would be the new system, the new Lance Parker, while being always those two men, the inner and the outer. She had spent countless hours on this matter of great strength. She understood Lance in the emotional and psychological sense far better than he would ever know himself. Deep within the mind of the man she loved, there still lurked a primal hatred of what had happened to him. Some day, and that would be soon, he would emerge from all this self-control she had brought him to develop. And when Lance slipped into his new self, that mighty new being, he would be possessed of great destructive power. There was every chance he would, subconsciously at least, seek the opportunity to enact a form of revenge. She envisioned scenes that would ensue from the use of ManFac's strength, and she sighed because oftentimes the only real difference between enraged boys and men is their size or the stubble on their chins. The anger and the rage are often the same, and so is the vulnerability. She had given to Lance, as a ManFac, an attribute few men enjoy, the ability to take a tremendous kick in the groin and be unaffected by the blow. She designed into the ManFac a groin cup of flexosteel and ceramics that would absorb any such blow. In fact, the man who ever kicked Lance in the groin would probably break his foot. Lee poured hot coffee for them both and turned back to the holographic projection and computer controls.
Fantasy time, she explained. I've been working on systems we can incorporate within the ManFac. Not immediately, but projects that will need your input even more than my own. The kind of stuff with which you're a lot more familiar.
He glanced at her as she brought a full-sized holographic ManFac into the three-dimensional reality before them. It stood suspended in thin air, glowing slightly, transparent so that all inner systems as well as the exterior showed. "Sounds like some more therapy," he said suspiciously. She shook her head.
Nope, straight engineering, Mr. Bones. For example, the plastiskin.
She touched controls as she spoke. Before them, the external skin surfaces of the holographic ManFac glowed brighter than the rest of the assembly.
As a nuclear systems engineer, you had to develop linings, pumps, pipes, holding tanks, valves, controls, the whole works. That would be reliable for years, without any servicing of any kind, because they carry radioactive solutions and chemicals, right? Right. So, how are they different from chemical plants?
He nodded. "I see what you mean. Ceramic liners, special alloys. They can withstand pressure, thermal extremes, shock, just about everything we can anticipate as a disruptive or destructive force."
Can you improve the plastiskin in the same way?
"Sure," he said lightly.
Not so fast. Let's say you make it able to endure 10 minutes of open flame. Will it retain the flex characteristics after that time?
"Not completely. You've got to compromise somewhere along the line," he said.
Right now, she went on, pointing, that plastiskin can take 90 seconds, 90 seconds of open flame. Then it undergoes a drastic chemical reaction. It stiffens and assumes undesirable brittle characteristics. How long can it absorb flame beyond 90 seconds and still retain the flexibility it has now?
He sipped coffee slowly. 3 to 4 minutes max.
That's at least twice as good as we have right now. How long would it take you to mix up a batch of your new plastiskin?
He looked at her. "I never said I would do it. Stan Loren at Global Synthetics. He's the absolute genius of this business. I worked with him. He could do it."
She studied him. Without asking personal questions?
"Yes."
She made some notes. You call him then. Now, let's look at a system that can endure open flame for, let's say, 3 minutes. What about the eyes all the time? all this time.
He leaned forward. I see what you mean. Sure, what's the use of walking through fire if you gouge out your eyes? He gestured at the glowing eyes of the ghostly ManFac. Same source, Stan. He can give us, maybe 60 seconds of a plexiglass material. They use it for supersonic aircraft. Takes more heat than steel without breaking down.
That means, she said, operating her controls, that if you were walking through a fire and you had to do it, you could snap down a plexiglass shield over the eyeball and at the same time maintain the ManFac integrity to prevent heat and gases from invading the suit?
It's not nearly as tough as it sounds. We dealt with those kinds of seals all the time inside the reactors.
All right. Breathing, then. We don't want this system limited to the oxygen duration of a man holding his breath, especially if he's exerting energy. What's the answer?
As she spoke, the nostrils, mouth, and respiratory system came into sharper, glowing relief. Snap shut ports for the nasal passages. Same for the lips, mouth, ears, all body orifices. They'll have to be stronger than the basic plastiskin because after exposure you'd want them to snap back into their storage receptacles. And, see there, where the back muscles are? The area to the upper side of the back? You could build solid oxygen containers in there, one to each side. Closing the nasal passages would open the oxyflow automatically.
Can you do it?
Of course, Lee. Look, it's not a new system. I mean, I don't have to play boy genius about that because the armored suits I wore, even when he faltered for a moment as he recalled the mountain crushing him. Even when I had the accident, well, any high radioactive or heat level triggered the same sort of thing we're talking about now. Automatically. In fact, we built 3 days of breathing oxygen and air scrubbers into the system. The trick, strangely enough, is not what to get to breathe. It's what to do with the exhaled gases. You want the suit sealed so you can't just pass them into the air. You have to store them, scrub the air, remove the unwanted gases and water vapors, and
Can you fit it into the ManFac system?
easy.
Perhaps not easy, but easily within their technical grasp.
Oh, that's not a quote. Perhaps not easy, but easily within their technical grasp. If they could build in resistance to enormous heat, even open flame, it was much easier to build in a resistance to terrible cold. Power, heat radiation wired through the inner system, defogging. It was, in fact, a simple modification of astronaut and deep sea diving systems.
The skull, Lee murmured. Ah, what a treasure.
Mine? Lance asked, nodding to the hologram. Or his?
Yours is more lovely than fascinating. Besides, I like to crawl around inside your mind to tickle your fancy.
She gestured at the hologram.
Him? A little trickle of electricity here, a pseudo-synapse there, lots of things that go snap and pop, but no real fun.
What did you have in mind? Instantly, in that way he knew so well, she was serious again. Her fingers flew across the control panel, and a glowing image appeared within the holographic ManFac.
That's you, the yellow area, your skull inside the ManFac housing. See how much space we have there?
So I'm empty-headed.
Not you, dummy. Between the two.
Oh, he said with a touch of innocence.
There's enough room there for an awful lot of printed circuitry, remote sensing systems, and...
No, he broke in. Break that stuff down into the torso. He used a flashlight-illuminated arrow that moved about the hologram. You put the sensors both in the cranial area and in the torso, but the main system, where everything is processed, well, if you put it into the torso, you can protect it a lot better and make access much easier. Using modular plugins, that means maintenance, well, you know.
Do I ever? She said, enthused. Do you realize the ideas you've just given me? I'd forgotten about available space within the body system. I could build in ultraviolet, infrared, even ultrasonic systems. With the power boosters and the new lenses, we could...
He curled a lip. How about X-ray vision? Then I could see through your clothes.
Your Playboy subscription run out?
I could see through a lot of clothes.
You're not funny, stud. You're right, but you don't even know it.
Meaning what?
Meaning, on a limited basis, right now I could adapt an X-ray system into ManFac.
He shook his head. You're talking too much power. You're also forgetting processing, plates, a few little items like that.
Forgetting hell. I could do it. She rubbed her cheek, thinking hard. Oh, not right away, but down the line. I could damn well do it all right. She turned to face him. A combination of fluoroscopy with an X-ray capability. Do you realize what that could mean?
Sure, you'd go crazy trying to figure out how to present the information to the inner soul of the ManFac. You know, like me.
Present it?
Sure. How do you transmit the optical readout of an X-ray or even a fluoroscopic system to the bearer? You can't have a screen, a cathode panel, or anything like that incorporated into the ManFac. It would be clumsy. It couldn't take any heavy shock. Its thermal envelope would be restrictive. And, well, presentation of data is the real snag here. It wouldn't be worth the effort. He drained his coffee. I don't think the X-ray thing should be a part of the system. Everything is a matter of degree, and we could keep right on going, and we could overload a beautiful system. Even ManFac has limits.
Go on, she urged.
I think we should draw a line with ManFac, he said, finding his own convictions as surprising to him as they were pleasing to her. The X-ray system shouldn't The X-ray system couldn't be a part of the biological system, so it's got to be an addition, a carry-on, or even a plug-in, just like placing a pacemaker in the chest of a heart patient, except that the pacemaker is essentially a bionic device to aid a failing physiological system.
And the X-ray ability
Is packaging, pure and simple, he finished for her.
very good. Very good, she said, genuinely pleased. I'll add to that. I'll drink a toast to it. The X-ray system is possible, but not now. I want to emphasize that. One day it will be possible. Of that I'm sure, but we'll have to wait for electronic microsurgery of the human body, and we're still a very long way from that stage. So it's a future far down the line, not a factor now. I think, she said slowly, that the line you want to draw is that the ManFac systems are limited to the gross extremities, the limbs, and the major skeletal and structural elements of the body.
I'm not yet ready to buy that, he said in an easy counterpoint. You're working with electronic systems. You're using wires thinner than human hair, memory chips for the computerized systems smaller than a pencil dot, that sort of thing. It seems to me that in some ways you're exceeding some of the really small, intricate, even the exquisite systems of the human body. He was surprised with her continued insistence that still she was right.
Look at it this way, then. God made the human eyeball of jelly and water and, well, let's call it superfine catgut and biological nerve fiber optics, and out of all that glop, we get the truly incredible optical system of the human being, all neatly connected to a computer center just loaded down with batteries of sensors, memory banks, and all those goodies we take for granted. Maybe God can string both celestial tennis rackets and human eyeballs with all their connecting systems from those few materials, but I can't. One day it will happen. It wasn't so long ago that flying and walking on the moon and television and computers were completely insane ideas, but, she shrugged, who knows? Maybe you're right. Maybe we ought to draw limits.
He nodded. Not because we shouldn't try these things, he emphasized, but only because we're not capable of joining them all together with meaningful reliability.
A large mouthful, very adroitly spoken. That packages our thoughts well, she added.
She sat up straight, leaned forward, and the hologram vanished. Lights glowed brighter about them as she adjusted the lab system. She turned to face Lance, slapping both hands against her knees. He recognized that gesture. Lee was about to lay something on him. He couldn't help it. He tensed.
Are you ready for another mouthful? She asked.
With you, I expect only the unexpected, he parried.
Rough one, lover.
I've grown accustomed to your smile, he sidestepped.
This one is different, Lance.
Her tone changed so quickly, gained warmth instead of that fencing they did so often, that he was caught by surprise. Okay, he said. Go ahead. It was the first time in many weeks that he'd seen doubt in her eyes.
I have an experiment I want you to try. You're ready for it. You'll never be more ready, in fact. She tapped the side of her head. Than in there.
Big mental barrier to break down, huh? It wasn't a question, and she recognized it from him.
That's it.
Well, don't play cat and mouse, woman. You don't need to anymore.
She sighed. I hope you're right, Lance Parker, because this is a low blow. I want you out of the ManFac system.
I don't get you. I go in, go out. So what's...
2 weeks out.
He took that one slowly. He didn't like it. Why? He asked after the long pause.
Lance Parker, survivor, has to test himself in the world out there.
Well, sure, I could.
Survivor, she broke in, not ManFac.
You mean... He couldn't even finish it.
That's right. The man with the cane. The guy with the scars. The guy who has a rough time walking. But he's learned how to drive again. And he can walk. He can do a lot of things. But he hasn't learned how to get out and mix with that world. It can be cruel. People stare at scars. They ask indecent questions. They can be absolutely rotten. It's tough getting up and down stairs, going to a restroom, eating with kids whispering about that man who looks so strange, talking to...
Enough, I have the picture.
Will you do it?
I don't have much of a choice.
What?
Her reaction was a total surprise.
Of course you do. I can't make you...
Not you, Lee. Me. You see, I'm not sure if I can handle it. He faced her with a crooked smile. And the only way to find out is to try. Her hand touched his.
Oh, Lance, it could be so difficult. Maybe we're rushing it just a bit. We could wait until...
Fish or cut bait. That's what time it is. He stood up and looked down at her. No, you're right. About meeting the world head on. But I got to admit, lady, it scares the hell out of me. Chapter 14. He had a long heart-to-heart with himself. The Lance Parker he'd known was dead. Make that fact a meaningful reality. You died. Yeah, life's a bitch. What? How can that be? You died, so how can you be discussing this? That was something to mull over. Okay, so his inner soul's position as a devil's advocate was forcing the issue. You're here because you got what the other poor bastards don't get. A second shot at life. But right now you've got to do it as what you really are. Not with that walking suit of armor Lee Grazzi whipped up for you. You've got to do this one on your own, baby. Fact of life. He walked, but only barely, with a foot-dragging and shuffling gait that rested for its pivot point on one leg and that cane. He swore he wouldn't use a crutch. He didn't care how much it hurt or what the hell it looked like to anyone. He was going to do it with just that one goddamned cane. He twisted and dragged and shuffled, but by damn, he was walking on his own. When you should be dead, right? Lay off, will ya? I can think for myself. That's the key. Think for myself. It was. The reality was that he had been given a prison sentence for life, trapped in this grotesque parody of what had once been a beautiful male form. But if he did think about it, he was alive. He had accepted life, and screw the poor little me syndrome. Right on. What's next? A mind becomes sharper when the demands increase, and he knew he must use his mind as never before because it was the only way to go. A blind man hears better than a deaf man sees better because... Oh. A blind man hears better and a deaf man sees better because of a factor called compensation. Nature's compensations are real. So are the minds of men, he argued with himself, and since the mind is every bit as important as the rest, since it's the absolute fulcrum for the rest of this body, what the hell is so wrong about depending upon the ManFac system? That ManFac system. Because, dummy, with all its wonders, without you as the motivating element. It's so much chrome-plated junk. It's a plumber's nightmare that doesn't go anywhere or do anything. The key is the catalyst. That's you. Then why the hell am I going through all this? Because you have to answer a question. Can you handle life without ManFac? If you can't, then you're more of a cripple than we ever dared suspect. That's what cripple means, baby. Not being able to handle life when you're at rock bottom.
He yearned for the ManFac. In that thing, he was.
Knock off the crap. I know what you're gonna think next. You've mixed the physical cripple and the beautiful mind with the machine, and we get some sort of low budget Superman, right? Well, you're wrong.
He was surprised by his self vehemence. He knew better than his own yearnings. Super beings have always been a fiction, and in respect to contemporary society, that's the way it would always be. He was an engineer, and he couldn't shake his own reality. Superman is a violation of nature's own laws. Entropy works for biological intellectual systems just the way it does for the clockwork of the universe. You never get something for nothing. You don't build castles on thin air or upon mental quicksand. If you run from reality, you're a sop to fairy tale dreaming. Before you give orders, you've got to know how to take them. Before you learn balance, you've got to experience the loss of balance and get up off your ass. A man and the ManFac become a superior system only with full preparation, training, and knowledge of what's involved. Superiority exists only with a complete grasp of the environment.
You're learning.
He nodded to his mental self. Under certain conditions, the best of the ManFac Yep, no. Under certain conditions, the best of the ManFac could be a liability. If he weighed 190 pounds and had to cross a rope bridge that could hold 200 pounds, he had it made. But in the ManFac system, he weighed 320 pounds, and that meant
right to the bottom of the gorge.
the first day was pure hell. He hadn't used his own body for more than an hour or two at the most. Then he could lie back, relax in a whirlpool, wait for Lee. Before the first hour of driving, even with power steering and power brakes and air conditioning, even with all those things, the mountain roads reached inside his body and his brain, and they rattled him good. Coordination drained his energy. Wheel and accelerator and brake and centrifugal force and depth perception and thinking ahead and driving ahead and matching his speed to the mountain roads and turns and upgrades and steep slopes. He wasn't that certain how long he'd been driving when he pulled to the side of the road. It's a misprint. When he pulled to the side of the road, a clearing overlooked a stunning stretch of a deep valley ringed by peaks. Once he'd been able to run up those peaks. They were duck soup to the mountains he'd climbed. Now he was grateful to sit in a car and suck in air and rest after just driving through the place. He had a coffee thermos. It helped. He ached through his arms and his legs, and his back had a red poker jammed through it somewhere, but remember, that first step is the bitch. The first hour is the killer. You're on your way. But he wasn't about to try out for an Olympic record. Screw that stuff. There was also common sense. He drove slowly for another hour, and the road turned and came out in the midst of a tourist camp. He had never been so glad to see a motel, and when he saw a drive-in registration window, he could have whooped for the joy of it. The thought sobered him. Drive-in registration? He'd forgotten.
You sure have. There's a whole world of people out here who can't walk, not even on crutches. They use wheelchairs, and that's why they can register this way. Then there are those without legs or arms, or others who are paralyzed. And would you believe that there are people in iron lungs? Tell you what, Lance, baby, the chaplain's on leave. Tell it to Jesus.
He grinned at himself and drove to the window.
It went easily enough, but he felt crippled, and he hated that. Oh, shut up. You could always have parked and walked on that cane into the office. This is how you wanted it. He clammed up to himself. He registered and paid with a MasterCard. He was amazed at how exhausted he was. He knew he wouldn't want to drag himself to a restaurant because you're not ready yet to try eating before other people. Face it, no crime there. Take it slow. He quit arguing with himself, stopped by a small all-night food store in the tourist parking area to buy sandwiches and milk. Getting back into the car was a Herculean effort. So was making it into his room. He dropped the food on a table, pushed the door closed, and sank gratefully into a wide armchair. Before he knew it, he was asleep. He came awake with the clutch of cold fear about his neck. Voices. What the hell? Dark outside. He saw the lights from the parking lot through the window where the drapes weren't fully closed. He started to get up. Every muscle in his body howled at him. He gasped with the unexpected pain. He gritted his teeth, made it to his feet, hobbled to the drape cords, and pulled them closed. He turned on the room lights and stared at the door. The lock. All this time he'd been in this goddamned room without throwing the bolt. All this time he'd been so helpless. His face whitened, and he felt his fingers squeezing the cane. He squeezed his eyes as tightly as he could until he knew tears ran down his cheeks. He forced down the thoughts that came swimming up from somewhere far down in his skull. But there was no denying them. They swam upward, a billion tadpoles carrying their dark and ominous message. The truth. Damn it, you've got to face it sooner or later. The truth. Admit it. Admit it. It's the first step to beating what you've refused to admit. He was soaked in his own sweat, and he hadn't moved an inch. Oh, God, make it go away. It refused to leave. It was here now, full blown and sitting astride his mind, grasping it with suckers and cups and talons and claws and teeth, and it wouldn't go away. You're afraid because you're so helpless. That's what scares the shit out of you. He heard himself gasping hoarsely for breath. It was true. The terrible, awful nightmare. He had visions of a body twisting, turning, running, jumping, wrestling, snapping gloved jabs into another man's face, feeling leather against skin, feeling leather against his own skin, laughing off the blows. That's what you were. No more. No more? What? The truth. He had a mental picture of a premature infant, wet and blood-slimed and not fully formed, thrust naked and wet and totally helpless into a world filled with gnashing teeth and hungry stomachs, and he wanted to scream because the tiny twitching form was premature, but the face was full-grown and developed, and he looked at himself, and then he felt the floor coming up at him, and he lay on the carpet, dry-heaving with this stinking, terrible truth. Helpless. Everything in the world out there was an enemy. He had a vision of looking at himself in the full-length mirror, and it showed him the rippling muscles and thick neck and powerful body of himself, ManFac, and he felt dizzy with the longing for that great form covering this shriveled hulk of what he really was. It took him an hour to get off from that floor. He dragged himself into the bathroom and sat on the floor by the tub, washing himself with a cold, wet towel. It took an enormous effort to return to the room, to force himself to eat the sandwich and drink the milk, because he knew he needed the energy. He sat quietly, his back against the bed, dozing, waking fitfully at any sound outside. Finally, he summoned all his strength and pushed and dragged the armchair before the door. His muscles were knotted like twisted ropes, and he went back to the bathroom and ran a hot tub, and somehow got his clothes off and carefully, ever so carefully, eased himself over the edge of the tub and slid gratefully into the hot, soaking relief. He would have remained there for an hour or more, but the fear knotted his stomach. What if someone tried to come through that door? What if he broke it down? He forced down the sudden panic, opened the tub drain, waited until the water was gone before lifting himself slowly and carefully. He went on hands and knees into the room, dragging his towel, drying off slowly, kneading muscles, one eye always on the door. Dry, he slipped into his clothes, brought his cane with him, propped up the pillows, and, half reclining, the cane in his hand, dozed and slept and awoke with sudden alarms before again falling nervously into sleep. The morning sun brought his eyes fully open. "Well, well, sport, you survived your first night. One down." On the fourth day, he shaved. On the sixth day, he ate a sandwich and drank iced tea through a straw in a small diner by the highway. He didn't know that he was already moving with far better confidence and strength than when he'd started this local trek. The waitress let her glance linger barely a moment longer when he'd pulled himself into the diner seat, but it was enough for his paranoia to turn the glance into a long, sneering stare. He pushed it aside. He froze with sudden fear when several boisterous Mexicans came into the diner, laughing and shouting among one another. He had visions of fists and boots and knives, and he gripped the chair with white knuckles until he could breathe without gasping. Leaving the diner, he nearly slipped on a wet spot and banged his hand painfully on the door, trying to prevent a fall. A strong hand gripped his arm, and he turned, eyes wide, trying to defend himself against the swarthy face.
Hey man, you okay? You could have hurt yourself there. You need some help to your car? I'd be glad to help. Which one is it?
He tried to pull his arm free. The Mexican sensed the pull and immediately released his hand.
Hey, no sweat, man. I know, amigo.
He stared at the dark face.
What do you mean?
He forced out. The Mexican laughed. He made a fist and banged his knuckles against his right leg. Lance heard a metallic sound.
I know, amigo. Left mine in Vietnam. You're gonna be okay, man. I see it in your eyes.
He was gone. Lance went painfully to his car, sat without moving for several minutes. Fists, knives, and boots, and a metallic sound where there had been a leg. He knew, and he understood. Lance rested his forehead on the steering wheel and wept. Aw, empathy. He knew where he was now. He'd looked down from Lee's office atop the mountain ridge and seen this town before. Stanley, that was the name. It lay in the valley far below the ridge. The one road through this mountain pass bore the town on each side of its constant curves. He drove slowly into town, debating whether to stop here for a bite and stay in the small motel, or to eat and then make the drive back up the mountain roads to the laboratory. 13 days. He was stronger. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced with animal caution, and the fear lay deep in his system instead of struggling at the surface to break loose. The gun had helped, to be sure. On his second day, he'd stopped in a sporting goods store and bought a .22 automatic.
Comes in 3 sizes, the clerk said. Got it in 22, 32, and 380, but you need a license for anything over the 22. That size is considered a plinker. Ain't much use for anything else.
The hell it wasn't. He knew enough about guns to know that a .22 in the forehead is just as good as a .44 in the belly for stopping a man. He bought a box of ammunition, and while he still pushed a chair against the motel door every night and kept the gun on the bed by his side, at least now he slept. Red neon lights glowed at him. Stanley Tavern. It had sandwiches and beer. He felt suddenly hungry and parked. He went inside slowly. He had the uneasy feeling that this was a mistake. These weren't the usual tourists. There must be construction somewhere nearby. The clothes were too rough-hewn, the voices too loud and raucous. Not even the jukebox turned up full could disguise the voices, the shouted laughter, the squeal of waitresses being grabbed. He slipped into a booth, waiting. He ought to get the hell out of here. He didn't like this. He wasn't being paranoid now. The place smelled of trouble. It always had some... It always had some... Oh, there's a line break. It always had some before the night was out. You could feel it. He ordered a hamburger and a beer. He hadn't taken 3 bites from the hamburger when he felt something tugging at the cane he had in the crook of his arm. A snarling sound came to him. It was a dog under the table. A goddamn dog with its teeth clamped on the other end of the cane. He pulled it abruptly. The animal yelped.
Get the hell out of here!
Lance snapped. I'm not actually sure if he's wearing the voice modulating neckband or not. He's probably naked in that regard.
Get the hell out of here!
Lance snapped. Then he knew trouble had found him. 2 long hairs off some construction crew, just as he'd figured.
Hey, what the hell you hit my goddamn dog for, you fucking queer?
Tight tank shirt, tattoos, beery breath, and a grinning sidekick.
I didn't hit him, Lance said quietly. I just pulled my cane away.
2 heavy fists rested on the table.
You calling me a fucking liar? I ought to shove that cane right up your queer ass. For 2 cents, I'll...
Leave him alone.
They turned to the waitress, disgust on her face.
You got a whole bar full of people your own size. Go pick on them. This guy can't help it, he's crippled.
The word tore through him. A waitress having to defend him against this. It wasn't much defense.
Fucking broad.
The man said it without concern as his powerful backhand split the girl's lip open and sent her sprawling against the wall.
You're next.
The man grinned, reached out for Lance. He didn't really think about it, but he got some leverage and brought the cane around to smack against the man's head. There was a cry of pain as the wood split and went flying off into some dark corner.
So the fag wants some action.
A powerful fist moved again, and Lance felt a terrible blow against his face. He was slammed into the back of the seat and then jerked forward brutally and struck again. He heard voices shouting and curses and men coming to his help, but he didn't know much else because his body was tumbling crazily over the edge of the booth, and he hit the floor with bruising impact. It went quiet. A state trooper stood over him. He saw the shiny boots and wondered what the hell was going on. He looked up and saw the big revolver held level to the other man's stomach. He heard voices, but they came to him from a distance. Then someone laughed, and the gun was being returned to its holster, and the trooper was picking him up.
How you doing, fella?
Lance looked about him, bewildered, aching.
My cane. I need my cane.
That drunk said you hit him with it.
Yes, after he hit the waitress.
She's gone. Splitsville for her, mister. You want to press charges?
Lance knew the routine. Barroom brawl. $50 would bail out the construction tough. It happened all the time here. Lance shook his head.
No charges.
The tough stood in the background, grinning, then walked off. Lance looked back to the state trooper.
I can use some help getting to my car.
Of course. Let's go. The trooper carried Lance more than helped him. Lance knew every eye in the place was glued to him. He stared straight ahead as they reached the parking lot, and the trooper helped him into the car.
You better get some ice on your face, Lance heard. You got a bad bruise. Gonna be a goose egg unless you get to it. Sure, thanks,
Lance mumbled. He couldn't wait to slam the goddamn door and get the hell away. The drive to the Hilltop Laboratory was another hour. By the time he eased into the driveway, Lance was no longer shaking with fury and pain.
You made it.
Don't you know you made it? Your worst fears came true, and you made it. It's all downhill from here on. He looked inside his own head. Shut up.
Shut up,
He told the voice that had been with him since he'd left the lab 13 days ago.
I don't need you anymore.
He kept blowing the horn until the driveway lights came on. He pulled into the garage as Lee opened the doors, and he waited until they closed behind him. Lee entered through the side door and stopped in her tracks, staring at his bruised face and torn clothes. She bit down hard on a knuckle to keep from crying out.
Just don't stand there, damn it. Get me a cane.
He pushed the car door open and glared at her.
Are you all right? Lance, you're hurt.
Just get me a goddamn cane, will ya?
She rushed inside, returned quickly with another cane.
What happened?
She asked as they walked together into the laboratory.
I flunked my test for the job of Sir Galahad,
He said. She was so astonished that she stood dead still.
You what?
He turned, leaning on the cane. He looked ridiculous with that swelling bruise and a lopsided grin.
I defended a lady, he said, or at least I tried to. I got to get me a stronger cane. I busted the one I had over that bastard's head.
Wait a moment, she pleaded. Start from the beginning, please.
Can it wait, Lee? First things first, okay? A quick kiss hello.
Of course,
And a lot of ice. Some in a bag for this bump and some in a glass. My God, I need a drink.
He walked past her, twisted, hobbling, dragging a foot slightly behind him, and whistling. Anyway, so that'll do it for this week. Hope people enjoyed. Sorry, my head's all plugged up, which happens pretty frequently on Mondays. I have to deal with a lot of dust and other schmutz on Sundays, and it tends to clog up my skull. Anyway, that was the next chunk of ManFac. We have more of that for next week. We're at, just about the halfway point now. Later this week, this Wednesday actually, we've got the I guess you could call it the final installment of Frankenstein. We've finished the story proper. We just have two appendix short stories that are in the appendix of the book. They're not too long, so it'll be a short one this Wednesday. And then on Friday, we've got more of The Jesus Incident by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. So we have so many things to look forward to. You know what else we have to look forward to? If you're an Amerikansky, a United States citizen, is voting. Tomorrow is voting day. And I abjure thee, please vote. Vote for whomever you want to vote for, but please do. I realize this will age like milk, or maybe it won't, but please get out there and vote. I mean, ideally do probably a mail-in ballot before this point in time, but still. Because goodness knows there's difficulties for a lot of communities in being able to vote, being able to vote in a timely, safe, healthy fashion, for various reasons. But with that said, if you don't want to think of it as a civic duty, if that doesn't compel you, think of it as exerting your influence on the universe at large. It's not much influence, but it's something. It's not nothing. Granted, it'll feel like nothing sometimes, but it's there. And if you don't participate, you can't exert any influence. So, all I'm saying is please vote. Otherwise, if you're in the rest of the world and you live in something that resembles a democracy, you also should probably vote. If you're in Australia, you are legally required to vote, as I recall. I think there's a fine. I don't remember how much it is. And I believe the same applies to Brazil. It's one way to get a read on the people. And it's kind of enforces the responsibility factor, the civic or social responsibility onto you. Makes you come to terms with it pretty quickly. I don't know if I don't know how well that would work in the United States. Might be worth a try. I hope more states wind up having um, what's it called? Ranked choice voting. Maine and I think Tennessee. Is it Tennessee? There's at least one other state that has. It's Maine and one other. At least one other state has ranked choice voting, and a certain political party gets up in arms and excitable over it and is like, "Oh, it's somehow fraught with peril," and it's like, "Nope, it's not." Oh, well, people just won't understand it. It's got extremely obvious instructions. It's like you literally cannot get it wrong unless you cannot read, in which case you have other problems than voting and understanding how ranked choice works. Hopefully, more states adopt something like that. I'm sort of surprised California hasn't. Um, Seems like the sort of thing they'd try to do, but anyway, it's pretty handy. It also means that in something that's nominally a two-party system but does theoretically have other actors, you can actually vote for the other actors and not waste your vote, if you want to put it that way. You could, for instance, vote for, say, Jill Stein. Yes, the Green Party has a candidate. Crazy, right? And vote for Kamala Harris. Because the way it works is like it goes through multiple rounds. So first round goes through. If your first pick doesn't make it, um, then whoever you had in second, your vote then goes to them, and third and fourth and so on. Um, so you can vote for everybody on the ticket in a ranked choice order, based on your preference, or just a couple people. It's okay. It's easy. It's shockingly easy. It's very easy, and it feels like it gets more of the will of the people. You have more control. You have more agency in a system that doesn't want you to have agency. Seems a lot of the time to not want you to have agency, and admittedly, there's all kinds of problems with the electoral college, and a lot of most of that stems way back to the 3/5 compromise, which is, I mean, just based on that alone, I think should be enough to get people to be like, yeah, no, we don't need the electoral college system the way it exists now, because it's predicated on, well, let's face it, racism and slavery. uh, it's pretty bad. It's yeah. So a big part of the problem is there, and then it's just kind of been institutionalized. Anyway, that's enough soapboxing for me. One last soapbox: stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I don't think I ask too much. Until next time, see you all later. And man, get you a significant other like Lee Grazzi. Man, she is supportive. She's great. Anyway, see you all later. A toodaloo.